Um, our guest today is Friedrich St. Florian, who comes to us from Providence, Rhode Island, and the Rhode Island School of Design and his practice there. And he's going to, as you know, be talking about his design for the World War II Memorial in Washington, D.C., which is really... do we have any ROTC students here today? I think there might be some coming later. That would be wonderful if there are, but we can have an excellent conversation in any case. I want to provide a little bit of background, though, and context for today's discussion. And first is to revisit our old friend, the monument. As you remember from our first lecture, this is a monument to Isaac Newton by the French architect Etienne Boulet. And when we think about monuments and people, we end up with a story. And I think one of the things that we're going to be exploring today, I'm going to revisit the eight words that we listed in the first meeting, and I want to try to contextualize for you before every visit to encourage you to think about those words and how they relate to each day's visit. So if you remember, we talked about 8 words with respect to design. The first was context. And in this case, by the way, our guest today is in the same field as I am, so it'll be a different kind of discussion than we've had than we will have with many people where they operate in a different field. But the context for the design of a memorial is physical. It's an actual place. But it's also, there's also a context that has to do with point of view, with timing. In this case, even I would argue, and I'd love to ask some questions about even advocates. There were advocates in the public realm that I think helped make sure that this memorial occurred. Another word that we have talked about is question. What is the question I am trying to answer? What is the problem? Who is the audience? This is another one today that I think we will talk about a great deal. Because the audience for a memorial is not necessarily obvious. There's more than one audience. And they might have different interests as you try to inhabit their sensibilities and points of view. And, I just list some disparate kinds of audiences here. The families of the lost, on the one hand. On the other hand, how about dissenters? Now, in World War II, unlike some subsequent conflicts, we like to imagine today there weren't any dissenters, but there were. Veterans, the nation at large, future generations. These are all different. All these audiences might require a different story. Empathy, the notion of understanding the world from someone else's point of view, is actually essential in design. The thing you are making, the thing you are designing, whether it's a system, a product, a space, a building, is going to be occupied or interacted with by others. And you have to try to get inside of them and understand what it is that they want or need. Just as an example, what should a visitor feel? How about a relative? That is, someone with a closer personal connection. But how about, actually, perhaps most important of all in the long run, a young person with no knowledge of the war? When I was a little boy, my father grew up in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, of all places. Hard to imagine a place in the United States for a young person interested in memorials that would be more relevant to visit. For those of you who don't know, the Battle of Gettysburg in the Civil War, the American Civil War, was the bloodiest battle of all of them, and it was the turning point, really, many people would say, in the Civil War. And it was a relatively small space in Gettysburg, Pennsylvania, was absolutely filled with bodies and death and destruction. And the subsequent 40 or 50 years saw the building of dozens of monuments and memorials to the dead there that are, interestingly, and again, this can animate some of our subsequent conversation, that are they're monuments actually usually to regiments, to particular small groups. it's an indication in a way of how fragmented those fighting in the Civil War were. There was the 31st Vermont Mountaineers, or the 19th New York State Riflemen, and all of them had a different kind of identity. The notion of iteration. We think about this mostly when you're in the act of designing something, that you come up with a proposed synthetic solution to the problem, and then you expose it to review, in this case maybe the thoughts of interested groups, a public review process, something like this, and then you go back and you work on it some more, and you synthesize it again, and you go back and you work on it some more, and again, that cyclical process is fundamental to almost every kind of design I can think of. Metaphor, I think, would be one of the things. I hope that you guys will really, towards the end of our interview, you guys will be interested in asking some questions, because this is really powerful stuff, I think. It's hard for me to think of something that we design as humans that has more lasting import than a memorial or a monument. It says something collectively that we seldom have other means of saying. But there are tools for kind of synthesizing the many different variables in a project, and we might ask some formal questions, or I might, about the nature, the shape of some of the elements in the plan, and the function, both practically and metaphorically, of some of the elements like water. Visualization, another thing that we talk about with respect to design of almost anything. Now, in this case, we might be curious to ask the designer about how points of view, a kind of intellectual construct, jibe with physical points of view, or places from which you view the memorial. In other words, there's a kind of dual meaning between perspective, that is one's point of view, and in the physical world, perspective, a station point, and a cone of vision. So this will be an interesting thing, I think, for us to talk about. Synthesis. How are disparate elements brought together? And you think about this, by the way, in the context of our first two speakers, our first two guests, and I think this will be very, very meaningful. Remember, Chris Hacker of Johnson & Johnson was talking about the many variables that impact the design of a product, choices that they make. At the end of the day, though, they have to synthesize all of those answers into a coherent and legible whole. Obviously, the same is true with a memorial. And so with that, I want to hand over the podium to our guest, Friedrich St. Florian, who will tell us much more about the World War II Memorial. Welcome. Let's see. You can to move forward. You can just there you're there, and then there's your first slide. It's up already, and that'll tell you the next one coming.
My next one, and if I need to go back.
Correct. That's right, and then you've got your pointer there.
Yeah.
Do you mind if I?
Well, good morning. Still morning, and thank you very much for inviting me. And I understand that the purpose of this class today is, above all, to have a dialogue, a discussion about the essence, perhaps, and what is important about memorials. As you all know, right now it's a little bit perhaps fashionable. We have many memorials on boards, and particularly Washington D.C. and the famous National Mall is. Many people fear that it will be overloaded with many more memorials to come. I have about 15 minutes to tell you about the World War II Memorial, how it came about, and it's a bit difficult to do it in 15 minutes. I barely managed to explain it in 2 hours, but I will do my best, and it will really be a synopsis. It will not be a comprehensive. Let me begin by showing you the site. I assume that most of you are familiar with Washington, D.C. Just to show you the highlights. This is the great axis. This is the great axis of the National Mall, and all of this between this avenue and the avenue over here is referred to as the National Mall. And then you have the cross axis here, which goes from the White House, which is here, across the National Mall over to the Thomas Jefferson Memorial, which is over here. Interesting enough, and I will talk about this in a greater detail in a moment, the Washington Monument is not exactly at the crossing of the two axes, and it turns out because the site for the World War II Memorial is the or what used to be the rainbow pool at the end of the reflecting pool. This is, of course, the Lincoln Memorial. You have the Lincoln Memorial, the Washington Monument, and the Capitol building on the hill. This is on a hill, and also the Washington. No, I'm sorry, the Lincoln Memorial is on a hill, and the site here is really part of that unbelievable center axis that we have here. And it was in 1996. In 1996, I had just come back after spending the summer in Europe when the competition was announced, and the editor of the major architectural magazine at the time wrote in her editorial that it's an impossible competition. It's an impossible competition. She actually, and I quote, she said, it will take a genius to come up with a solution. Of course, that inspired all the architects that you can imagine to participate in it. And the rationale for her saying it was an impossible competition is because, number one, the rainbow pool is is on the register of historic places in Washington, D.C. The mall itself, the National Mall, is our national village green. It's absolutely sacred. It's untouchable. The idea to in the 20th century to yet insert another major edifice into this triumvirate between the seat of government, the founder of the nation, Washington Monument, and Lincoln, President Lincoln, who saved the nation 100 years later, and to insert something into it. It was like heresy. It was really like heresy. Moreover, then, of course, the conditions for the competition were that, first of all, you could not touch the rainbow pool because it was historical. Number two, you cannot interfere with that grand vista between the Lincoln Memorial and the Washington Monument. So here you have a site where essentially you're not allowed to build. And yet at the same time you're asked to commemorate one which was the watershed event of the 20th century, which changed the course of world history in mid-20th century, right? And that was unbelievable, challenging, and not surprisingly, everybody who was who in American architecture, from Venturi to Steve Hall and everybody participated. It was a question of almost like of honor to do it. So that is the context. This next important thing was, for me, when I decided to enter the competition, I very, very quickly had to become a student of Washington. I knew very little about Washington, and what I discovered was quite extraordinary, and that was really the unbelievable influence of Thomas Jefferson. Thomas Jefferson, as you know, was President Washington's Secretary of State. He was the first Secretary of State. Both Washington and Lincoln were, Jefferson were men from Virginia. They literally handpicked the site for the new capital, and Jefferson was in his heart, he was absolutely an architect. He was a great architect. He built as you know, the major buildings at the University of Virginia, and he was before that the ambassador to Paris. He was unbelievable knowledgeable in architecture, and so he couldn't help himself. This is actually a sketch by Thomas Jefferson, the first sketch that he sort of envisioned for the beginning of Washington. Here you have the Potomac River, and that is the beginning. Interesting enough, President Washington, who didn't really have the time to think about these matters, but it was Washington who invited the architect, you help me, Pierre L'Enfant from Paris, to make the master plan for Washington. And as you can see, the master plan from Washington really took quite a lot. Number one, it took a lot from Versailles, and number two, also from Jefferson's sketch. Interesting for us as students at the time was that, of course, the Potomac River, all of this was water, and the mall literally ended pretty much at the axis from the White House, which is over here, and this was then the future location of the monument to Jefferson, and there was nothing to the west. And then this is just a close-up, and I will skip that. And then the next major event, many master plans were executed, but in 1902, L'Enfant's plan was pretty much forgotten, and the development of Washington was pretty unruly, and they didn't really follow much Pierre L'Enfant's plan, except the layout of the streets. And so there was a commission formed, which was named after the then Senator from Michigan, McMillan, that was called the McMillan Commission, and appointed to the commission were really the most important architects working at that time, like Daniel Burnham from Chicago, and from McKim, Mead and White. It was John McKim, and then the famous landscape architect Olmsted. And so it was a very powerful commission, and they then followed pretty much. I mean, they took the clue from the Pierre L'Enfant plan, which were these big diagonals. The characteristic of the Macmillan plan were these diagonal main roads, Pennsylvania Avenue here, for instance, from the White House to the Capitol building. And at the intersection of these big diagonals, there were those piazzas, and of course these piazzas all later on received smaller monuments, mostly generals on a horse. But the important part of the Macmillan plan, that they extended the National Mall now from here all the way to here. In other words, all of this became infill. And then this was designated as the mount or the hill for the Lincoln Memorial, and you can also see the reflecting pool. And here you have our site. You have the site for the World War II Memorial, which is the Rainbow Pool site. And again, I just point out that this is the footprint of the Washington Monument, which is not directly on the axis. And that had to do with simply the foundation. The soil was so poor at that particular that the engineers refused to put it there. Very, very quickly, this is just a close-up of the Macmillan plan. That was interesting for me because the Macmillan Commission actually foresaw the need for future memorials, and so they actually incorporated in their design what became which was not built, which was a memorial garden where they would perhaps in the future have additional memorials, which was never built. Here is 17th Street, and here is the Rainbow Poolside. And so here you have, this is just a view of this memorial garden. And here you have, it was a two-stage competition. In the first stage, you had the architects had to submit fairly few ideas. What counted was really the idea. And then they selected finalists, and then the finalists went on to stage 2. And this is our, this was really our stage 1 entry. But everything that we had as an idea was already there. And interesting enough, although I had become a student of Washington and particularly of the teachings and the desires of Thomas Jefferson, it became absolutely clear to me that aside from the issue of what is the right memorial for World War II, it was above all an urban design problem. It was an urban design problem because how can you have a construct or a memorial that is commensurate with the significance of this event, and yet at the same time not interfere with the grand vista from the Lincoln Memorial to the Washington Monument, and not interfere with the Rainbow Pool. So our idea, and that was very, very clever, I must say. What we did is we created a negative space because both the Lincoln Memorial and the Washington Monument are on a little hill. So we wouldn't want to have another hill in the middle of it, and we couldn't because it would interfere with the view. So we lowered the plaza. We created a plaza. The plaza was the metaphor, really, of the ancient Greek assembly space, the agora, and so we wanted to have an open space. And then in the original brief, they also asked for interior spaces, and the interior spaces they asked the interior spaces to be underground, and I couldn't get myself to put anything underground. I thought that the World War II memorial should not be something that's underground, that you have to walk down, and it didn't seem right. So what we did, we lifted the earth. And I created these earth berms. You see, I had these earth berms on both sides, and the interior spaces were under the earth berm. So we cheated. No, we just lifted the ground, right? At the same time, we lowered the plaza, right? And the competition asked for 2 floor plans, one on the ground and one underground. And I only had one plan. I didn't have 2 plans. And I remember when we were working with my staff at the time. Oh, I have the wrong button here. And I was working with my staff at the right time, and I looked up and I said, look, we're going to win this competition, right? Because we have only one plan, right? That was just so compelling. Interesting enough, I did a lot of competitions in my life. We won second prize at the Pompidou Center a long time ago. If we had won, I would have been elsewhere. But but this is important. It's probably the one of the. I do a lot of sketching. You know, architects do sketching. And I talk about that later. I literally had the idea within 1 hour, right? And this was one sketch, and it tells it all. Everything is here: the plan, the section, the perspective, the view, looking down from the Washington Monument. Right? And then, of course, again, I cannot tell you everything, but we did a lot of studies. You know, we had these earth berms had to have the right height. As you can see, in between there is this grand vista that remains open, and the earth berms they're enhancing, they're embracing that beautiful view, and it is one of the great urban vistas, if not certainly in this country, but I think in the world, one of the greatest views. For when you stand at the portico at the Lincoln and you look towards the Washington Monument, I think your heartbeat goes up. It is so powerful, right? And we framed the view. It was like creating a beautiful frame for it. And I was very proud of the earth berms. And then we worked with the landscape architect Friedrich St. And the landscape architect came up with the idea that we should. This is just that was the competition entry, as you can see, just to show you the size of the memorial. The memorial is now around. We had to surround it. This is the rainbow pool. It was very, very large, and when we were chosen finalists, we were asked to encourage, let's put it, make it bigger, make it bigger, make it bigger. We got the wrong advice, but this was then the final, the second stage entry. Now it's elaborated, and what is important is to show you that we covered the earth berms with white roses, and that was Van Sweden's idea, and he kept telling me there are white roses in California. They grow from February to, I don't know, to November, and of course the white rose is a very powerful metaphor for young people who die prematurely, and so we absolutely embraced this idea. The Park Service hated it, of course, right, because they would have to maintain it. We had another problem, and we had on the inside. So this is the plaza. It was slightly sunken into the ground. Then we had 48 columns. We put 48 columns around here, and then we had the earth berms. And the earth berms, the idea of the earth berms was they would blend into the National Mall. You would not practically see the World War II memorial until you enter into it. You know, it was so, it was in a way camouflaged, right? And it was only when you enter into the plaza, then all of a sudden, the grandeur of the event, the victory, you know, of the triumph of democracy over tyranny, it was celebrated, right? It was celebrated, and we're very, very careful. We're very, very careful we didn't take this idea of celebration lightly. We didn't take it lightly because we are working right now at the height when a completely new kind of memorial that never existed before had come into existence, which is what critics now call I didn't coin the word, so I have to always remember it. The healing memorials. The healing, and the first one was Oklahoma City. And then, of course, we have 9/11 in New York. These memorials did not exist prior to that, to the later part of the 20th century. And they had to be instant memorials. They had to be built right away, you know. And this was because this was about the healing memorials were designed to heal pain and sorrow that was inflicted by absolutely irrational terrorist acts. Okay, that was so different from the World War II memorial. The World War II memorial was the moment of triumph of democracy, right? And so we were actually designing in a very hostile environment. I just wanted to point out, we again, this is a metaphor that actually comes from Asia. We cut the columns at the top, and again, in ancient Asian history, that is the metaphor again for a young life cut short, right? And in addition, we had a minor political problem. We fully well knew that there were 48 states during World War II, and I have to watch my time. There were 48 states, right? And that the problem was that the senior senator from Hawaii was on the jury, right? And so I said, I'm not going to get into this, and so we made 50 columns, right? And I said, look, they should figure that out. In the end, well, I'll show you what happens in the end. And so I skip about that, and then we won the competition, and on the 17th of January 1997, the project was unveiled in the White House, and the professional advisor to the jury literally took me and shook me and said, he said, God damn it. He took me aside and he said, God damn it, you know, we forgot to put into the brief that we said you can't dodge the rainbow pool, but they didn't say that you can't lower it, right? And he said, God damn, we didn't put that into the brief, right? Yeah, but this is something very important for all of you, for those of you who perhaps want to be an architect one day. You can't win competition unless you break the rules. Right? There is always somewhere you have a break rule. And what we did, we rebuilt it. We destroyed it and rebuilt it. We rebuilt it peacefully, but we rebuilt it 6 feet lower. And we got away with it. But then by the time we went from the White House to the first meeting at the Commission of Fine Arts, we were taken apart. We were taken apart. The critics were all over us. And the attack was particularly focused on the interior spaces. This is the competition-winning design, which was this size, and this is the one that was built, which I'll show you in a moment. And the attack was, you're building a museum. I mean, this is interior. This is not a memorial. I mean, you're camouflaging. You're building a museum into the center line of our sacred national mall. Right? And it was a fireball that went up. Right? And the critic, the architectural critic of the Washington Post, Benjamin Forgy, wrote a beautiful, beautiful essay. Right? And he gave the definition for memorials in his essay, and he said, a memorial is not a school, it is a shrine. It is not to teach, but to inspire. Right? And he set the definition between what a museum can do and what a memorial can do, to inspire. Right? And I took this away, you know, as I knew that our urbanistic concept, that's the one we won the competition with the framing, right, and leaving the view. But now the burning issue was, but how do you commemorate World War II? How do you, what is it that would make it specific, right? And I looked and I looked and I looked and I looked at the Washington Memorial, and I said, you know, the Washington Memorial is very, very beautiful, but it's not only quite frankly, it's not only to commemorate President Washington, but it's the birth of our nation, right? I mean, it's it is an absolutely phallic symbol, and it's giving birth to the nation, and it is in its purity and its simplicity, it is very powerful. And then the question is, how about Lincoln? I mean, why would you remember Lincoln in a Greek temple? I mean, why would you, of all presidents we had, put him in a Greek temple, right? I mean, it's okay to put Jefferson into a replica of the Pantheon, right? He loved Rome, ancient Rome. He loved it. He was an absolutely classical architect, and so for that, I could live with that. But Lincoln, why put him into him? And then I realized that actually, what really matters is the station that a particular event that you want to commemorate holds in the history of a nation, right? What's in the history books matters, right? And if you look at it, you see that obviously the birth of the nation is a major chapter in our history, right? The Lincoln presidency and the liberation of the slaves is a major event in the history of our nation, right? And because they are in the history books, and all the students and high school students have to learn it again and again and again and again, it's imprinted in your memory, in your mind, and it really doesn't matter in the end what the form or the shape really is, right? I mean, think of there's a beautiful, for instance, there's a very beautiful memorial to the Spanish, to the American-Spanish War at the Columbus Circle in New York City. Nobody knows about it. Right? The history, the Spanish-American War is a footnote in the history books, right? No more than a footnote, right? It's forgotten, right? And so this is very interesting as we go on. So anyway, we went to the Commission of Fine Arts. They took away all the interior spaces. They said, you can't have any interior space, it's gone. And it has to be half the size, right? And furthermore, we don't like columns. We have too many columns in Washington. No more columns, right? There was J. Cutler Brown, who was the chairman of the Commission of Fine Arts, was a very powerful gentleman. He was also a fantastic orator, and when he spoke, everybody was listening. There was there was not much of a discourse. So we had to shrink it, and so here you have is what we built. We had to fundamentally come. These are the famous oak trees. You see, there is a walkway. This is 17th Street. Washington Monument is at the bottom here. The Lincoln is on top. That's the beginning. That's the beginning of the reflecting pool. These are the walkways that go from the Lincoln Memorial all the way across 17th Street up the hill to the Washington Monument. And these are the famous oak trees, and they are important and precious. And we simply had to go back inside of it. As I said earlier, we got the wrong advice from our client at the time. And then we did, again, an enormous amount of studies about the geometry. You know, we wanted to make sure we started out with the rainbow pool, which is this is the rainbow pool, right? And then we also took into account the circles of those walkways, and fundamentally we created a set of geometries that absolutely fit the site that was given to us. And then here you have an early perspective of what actually got built. And that is an aerial view looking from the hovering above the reflecting pool towards the Washington Monument. And but the principal idea really the principal idea the principal idea of number one, the sunken plaza, which was really the winning design idea, and number two, that the memorial, when you look from the outside in, is barely visible, and certainly not obstructing. To the contrary, it is framing. It's framing the great view, and which is evident in all the in the pictures that I'm going to show you. We were under attack. It was just unbelievable. I mean, there was a group of people who said, we're cementing over the mall. We're blocking the view. I didn't know what to do. Everything was a lie, right? I asked for help, and they looked at me and said, "You want a friend in Washington? Get yourself a dog." Yeah. And that is the view into the other direction again. We have 17th Street here, right down here, and this is the principal entrance, and here you have the reflecting pool. And now, just to talk about the principal parts of the memorial, the really most important part is the plaza, and the plaza is taken from the idea of the plaza was the Greek the public space in ancient Greek, the birthplace of democracy, and the idea was people should come here and celebrate that we are free, that we are a free country, a free nation, that we can speak what we like to speak, and it is because of the soldiers that protected us in mid-20th century. And that was really the most important aspect. Secondly, we have those two pavilions, and these two pavilions, they do two things. First of all, they do the markers on the National Mall to know where the World War II Memorial is, and at the same time, metaphorically speaking, they represent the two major theaters of World War II, the European theater on one side, and the Pacific theater on the other side. Number two. Number three, we also had to celebrate the bonding of the nation. Never in the history of the United Nations has the nation been as united as it was during World War II. Within 6 months, women went to the factories, and we became the arsenal of the world, and we became the breadbasket of the world. It was just extra. So the bonding of the nation, the home front, we had to celebrate at the same time. And finally, we wanted to take advantage of all the water. First of all, we had already the water of the rainbow pool. We had to rebuild the fountains, which weren't working since 1928, I believe. The rainbow pool was finished in 1922. The rainbow pool was named because those fountains created rainbows. And we added waters. We added water on the side. There's a waterfall here and a waterfall here, and you will see shortly. We also have water basins at the bottom of the two pavilions. And the water is the celebration. It's the anima. It's really the anima of the World War II Memorial. It's the sound of the water that adds to celebration. And Benjamin Forgy actually told me once that he thought that because at the center here is the fourth piece in terms of the iconography of the World War II Memorial. Here is where we commemorate those soldiers that gave their lives, of which there were more than 400,000. And then we had the waterfalls on both sides. And Benjamin Forgy told me that when he stands there, he can hear the drums of the filled of the filled burial. And that made me also shake. Yeah. We were also accused that it is still huge, that our pavilions are gigantic, right? This is a true measured drawing that compares the Lincoln Memorial to our modest, small pavilions here. As I said, it was all absurd, but we had to live with it. I show you now a few pictures of what the memorial looks. I think when you're inside, you do have a sense of significance, and there's there's this question, of course, why is it classical? Why did I choose a classical architecture and another contemporary architect? I'm a modern architect. If you look at my website, this is really the exception of everything I did. But it was a result of mine. I'm way over my time. It was a result of the fact that I studied Washington, and I studied Jefferson. And Jefferson said so clearly that Washington should remain pure and simple and consistent with the Declaration of Independence. And it will be, and this is his own words, and he said it will be New York and Chicago who will be the centers of commerce and industry, right? But he did not want, he wanted Washington to remain pure and not affected by the and I don't want to use the word corruption, but the excesses, let's put it, yeah, of financial enterprises. I will rush up a little bit. Inside, this is a view from inside the pavilions. Here again, talking about, there's a lot of metaphor here. The inside, the two pavilions where we celebrate the victory, right? We have two suspended laurel wreaths, and the laurel wreath again is the metaphor, going back to the Roman times, the metaphor of the Victoria, of the returning soldiers that came home with a victory, right? And it was, it was one of those things. For many, we didn't celebrate the victory enough, which was particularly military, and for others, we celebrated it too much. We probably did the right thing, somewhere in between. And here you have the pillars. We were told not to have any columns, so we modeled pillars that represent and now we have 42 of them. Remember, in the competition design we had 50, but now we had forgotten about the territories. During World War II there were 48 states and 8 territories, right? So we have 48 plus 8 is 56, more or less, right? And so this is what we have. And then there was this issue, how do you, each of those pillars has a name. Well, these are actually the territories. But then here you have, from beginning, you have the states. And so there was this question, how do you, around the memorial, how do you, where do you put one versus the other? And so it wasn't my idea, it was in the hands of the military historians, right? They were pretty good, I must say they were pretty good. And they said, look, why don't we do it the way you do it if you have a state dinner, right? And you have a big table, and you start with the seat of honors, right? And we decided clearly what we call the field of the gold stars, where we commemorate those who gave their lives. That was the head, and so next to the right was the first honor seat, and to the left was the next one. And so we just went how the states came into the Union, right? And so Delaware is here, and Pennsylvania is over there, and then you take it. Massachusetts comes pretty soon, and Virginia, so on. And then by the time you come to the other end, we have the territories, right? Of course, that is a great, delightful thing for the park rangers who constantly ask the question, how come Texas is over here? Texas over here. And so they can explain it. No, they have much fun of it. I just show you here very briefly. This is this is at the end of the ramps that bring you into the memorial, and this is the beginning of what we call the Field of Gold Stars, which is quite powerful. We have 4,000 gold stars, each gold star representing 100 dead, and they're all sculpted. They're all sculpted. They're not. They're not mechanically stenciled by the sculptor. I shouldn't say that, but they're actually real gold. Not pure gold, but gold. I don't know if there's a word for it. So, yeah, gold-plated or something. Yeah. And this is the view from the entrance on 17th Street towards the Lincoln. It was very important for me. It was absolutely vital for me that the wall not cut the Lincoln Memorial. That you had to see the entire Lincoln Memorial until you reached the Rainbow Pool. All right. And that's a view again inside the towers, and there are some details of the delightful thing was, architects always have to work with veneer when it comes to stone, and if you normally get 4 inches, you go home and you feel you're lucky. And we had everything is solid. Everything is solid. And some stones were monster stones. Right? But I could tell you stories, but I don't have the time. So I'm just going forward here. The anima, the water is so important. And if you go and visit the World War II Memorial, I urge you to go in the evening when you have the light and the water, right? And listen to the sound. This is now on. These are the waterfalls at the bottom of the 2 pavilions, and then here, that's one of my favorite slides. Actually, early in the morning, but as you can see, the water is so important. The anima, as I call it, and that's my all-time favorite. Picture showing you the Field of Gold Stars, and having Lincoln looking down from his perch down to the World War II Memorial, and I've always said that both Lincoln and Washington, if they must be very pleased to look down and see what the Americans did in mid-20th century. Thank you. I'm sorry, I overran by leaps and bounds. Yeah. Well, you just have to invite me back.
That's it. Well, that is. I think for those in the majority of the audience who are not architecture students, who don't encounter this sort of thing all the time, I think it must be impressive to the students, as it is to me, how many different constituencies, criteria are involved in something.
Yeah.
I just took my son to Washington, D.C. last summer, which is, by the way, where I started my career. Taking him to the memorials is really, it's so, I think, transformative. for a young person because I think I asked, but not in this class, in one of the earlier classes. How many of you have been to Washington?
A lot, yeah.
Now, did many of you go on your own or in high school trips? How about a high school trip? Yeah. Okay. Well, so most went on your own, but I think it's great that people do that because it's such a. I mean, to get. I guess maybe we can start off with the whole notion of a story, and this image, of course, captures that beautifully. That in many ways, the most important decision about something like this is where they're going to, where on the mall, where in the narrative does it occur? Yeah. And I mean, maybe I could start with a question about, were you? I mean, we can get into the difficulties of the site in a second, but were you surprised by the location that they chose for this memorial? Because that's so important in Washington.
Yeah, yeah. Well, first of all, you know, I was not involved. I forgot to say that the when legislature was introduced to actually build the World War II memorial, there was a question: what entity, what government entity should oversee, essentially become my client, the architect's client. And the Senate decided to go with the American Battle Monuments Commission, which was the commission that was founded at the end of World War I to oversee the construction of the overseas cemeteries in Europe and Asia and North Africa. And it's quite a powerful commission, and on the basis, because they have done very well. And so that was actually my client. And the difficulty with that was, in part, is that it's a commission that is, not surprisingly, heavily composed of military men, mostly generals and admirals. Luckily, luckily the chairman of the Site and Design Commission, that was a small group of that big commission, was Ambassador Hayden Williams. So he was not a military man, although he was very close to the military, and that was a blessing for me, because it was very difficult for me to be, you know, constantly surrounded by this military man, and luckily, I must say, there was this Hayden Williams that stood by me, and so did J. Carter Brown, the chairman of the Commission of Fine Arts. And the three of us really sometimes had to stand really back to back, you know, and fight in all directions, right? And I think, and also, I think Senator Dole, who was, you know, who was the principal fundraiser for the memorial, he was also very supportive, right? And Senator Dole, as you probably know, was he was probably one of the best storytellers I ever knew, and he loved to tell his stories. But one of the stories he told in the middle of when we were in this fight, you know, and we had 24 public hearings, you know, between the Commission of Fine Art, the Commission of Fine Arts, and the Commission, the Commission of Fine Arts, and then there is the National Capital Planning Commission, was the second commission. Every commissioner is a presidential appointment. And I don't know what happens to people when they get the presidential appointment, but there's something that seems to makes them a little pretentious. I don't know. And then there was the Park Service, which was the worst group, as you can imagine. And I had to do a battle with them all the time. And so Senator told us a story when he was in a battlefield, and he remembered that his commanding officer took all the young officers. That was before an assault of one of the islands in the Pacific, right? and he took all these young officers into his that was on a ship, right? I don't know, in the command post or whatever it is, and he said, "Gentlemen, you will find that the enemy is in front of you. You will find that the enemy is in the back of you. You will find the enemy is to the right and to the left. In other words, the enemy is exactly where we want them to be. Good luck." Yeah. And it was so charming, to in all this. I mean, just to show in the end how by comparison our battles weren't so big. But now I forgot your question.
Well, no.
Yeah.
It's completely fine. The business about having so many audiences.
Yeah.
I think it is not obvious to. By the way, the Senator Dole to whom you're referring is largely unknown to this audience, and I'll remind them that it's Senator Bob Dole of Kansas, who was a very leading senator in the 1990s. Actually ran against Bill Clinton for president in 1996, and along with Senator Daniel Inouye, were both wounded World War II veterans who were in the Senate, which lent them additional credibility.
I would think it lent them an aura.
Sure.
No, but coming back to this issue of different audiences, I think this is a very important question. Right? Who is really the audience for a memorial like this? That question was asked again and again and again, and at the end of the day, I think these memorial, regardless whether it's the Washington Memorial or the Lincoln Memorial or the Jefferson or Roosevelt Memorial, I think it's the future generations of America. These memorials are not built. Yes, on the one hand side, there was this other pressure on us, on me, on my team, on everybody. He said, "Look, Friedrich, 1,000 veterans are dying every day, right? Why can't you hurry up? Why can't you hurry up?" Right? It's a tremendous pressure, right? And there was no question that the one of the really important audiences were the veterans, right? And the veterans, the World War II. Let me talk for this just for 2 minutes. The World War II memorial veterans, they came home as heroes. They came home as heroes. The nation, the grateful nation, bestowed upon them. They could go to college. There was the GI Bill, right? They came home triumphantly. The nation embraced them. They gave them opportunities. They didn't need a memorial. I mean, that was the last thing that they even thought about it.
At the time.
Yeah, which was quite different from for instance, the veterans that came home from the Vietnam War. When the people came back from the Vietnam War, people looked the other way. I mean, very often, not always, but at times they just looked away. It was an unwanted war. And we have 2 such wars coming to a closure now that are somewhat similar, right? And they will certainly get a memorial. And they needed a healing memorial, right? Instant, subito, right there, they needed a memorial because they had to go there so that they could hold hands and cry with each other, right? But that was very, very different. And yet, at the time when finally it was decided that the World War II veterans deserve a memorial, the outpouring was fantastic, right? And I remember this was just when we finished the memorial. I went down. I spent quite a lot of time in Washington in preparation to the official opening, and already because it was. They were dying under your eyes, so to speak, and they came in buses, in tour buses, and there were occasions when I was talking to somebody, and then all of a sudden over at the wall of the Freedom Wall where we had the gold stars, all of a sudden they started to sing. They held hands and they started to sing, and you couldn't help. Tears came just down from everyone, right? And then later on, they founded the Freedom Flights, where there was a gentleman who has a small airplane company somewhere in Minnesota, and he started the Freedom Flights, and this mushroomed into a national, in an absolutely national phenomenon where cities and towns collected money and had veterans fly to Washington to see their memorial.
Who would not have otherwise been able to afford to do so.
They were too old and too fragile to go, and it became very, very expensive, because with every veteran they had to send either a relative or a nurse they were all in wheelchairs, right? And I do remember, I mean, one of the most touching moments was at the Memorial Day 2004, when the memorial was when it was inaugurated, and I was honored to be on the grandstand. I have never ever seen so many wheelchairs in my life. I mean, the front part of the audience were the veterans in wheelchairs. Were in wheelchairs, and I remember. There was this moment when, again, Senator Dole, who was one of the speakers, said, "Those of you who can, will you please rise?" Right? And then you saw men who clearly, under unbelievable pain, rose themselves from their wheelchairs, because it was, no matter how much pain, it was important for them to stand. Right? And these moments are just unbelievable, right? So on the one side, yes, the audience are the veterans, and there's no question about it. But in the long run, in terms of history, I think it's the future generations. I think the memorial, all the memorials, should inspire future generations, right? To go there and say, look, if we are called upon to defend our nation, we will do the same thing. And the greatest regret I have, I have two regrets, but one perhaps is the greatest. Over that wall over the wall of the Gold Star, I wanted the inscription of the American poet who was in the war, McLeish, which has a line, which
Archibald
says,
McLeish.
Archibald McLeish has a line that says, "We give you our death, you give them meaning." And I wanted us to be over here as a question, right? Not an answer, but a question. We offered our lives, but you give meaning to that act of giving our lives. Meaning, young people should think about that, right? And respond to it. And I couldn't get it done, because the military, I don't know why military people don't like poetry. I don't know.
Well, it's interesting.
I hope your father is not a
No. I'm sorry. I invited a whole class of ROTC students to come today, and I don't know what happened. But I think it's such a useful discussion when talking about design, when talking about the active choices that we make, to understand how different audiences work, and how a designer has to. I loved, by the way, on a lighter note, especially when hearing Bob Dole's name, whether or not you would have voted for Bob Dole in your life, I don't know, but there's never been a funnier politician than Bob Dole. He's absolutely hilarious. If you ever have a chance to go on YouTube and find any of his interviews, he's hysterical. But I so appreciated that you were faced with a situation precisely as I described in a previous talk about designers having to offer what I would call both and solutions. They have to solve more than one problem at a time. Often those problems are in direct 180-degree competition with one another. I joked that I remember when I did more residential work, you would meet with a couple. Oftentimes, the client would be a couple, the worst possible scenario, and they're looking for a space that is both wide yet narrow, tall yet short, and a couple of giggles. But you were faced with precisely that. We want it to be grand. It's a very important memorial. I just don't want to be able to see it. I want it to be significant and invisible. I think that's, that captures. And by the way, when you go to see this memorial, it meets those criteria so well. Right before we went to it, not surprisingly, we were at the Lincoln Memorial, standing between the main two columns.
And you cannot see it.
No, you can't see it at all. I mean, and in fact, I was kind of looking for it. And it was a sunny day. And I will say they weren't quite done with their revamping of the whole reflecting pool, which, as you know, has been its own multi-year debacle. I think I hope it's finally done now. But I want to segue though to another issue, and that is, when we think about memorials in the recent, and you're so right, the explosion of memorials for newer purposes, and the critic from D.C. is right that there's no question there's been an explosion of memorials that perform a much more contemporary role, whether it is healing or, I think that's probably as good a word as any, is completely true. And it reminds me that how many memorials were done long after the event being memorialized versus those that are done sooner.
Instantly.
So, for example, the Lincoln Memorial was done in 1922, which is, let's say, 50 plus years after Lincoln's death. So there was an opportunity for society to reflect on the ultimate impact. What exactly are we memorializing? In other words, if you did a Lincoln Memorial a year after his death, let's say during the presidency of Andrew Johnson, it probably would have been a different thing. And similarly, and I'm sure you get asked this question, so obviously probably the most significant and transformative memorial of my generation, I would say, is certainly Maya Lin's Vietnam Veterans Memorial. In terms of its influence, we showed some images. They're vaguely aware of it, so the architecture students more than the others, but I showed images of it in our first talk. And it's perhaps another category of memorial that I would describe as more of an experiential memorial and less of a, let's say, reflective. It's not to say you don't reflect when there, but there's actually a narrative moving through it, and the story is different, very different, as you alluded to. This is one, and if I could say, every story is told from a point of view. If you ask Eastern Europeans to describe what happened in World War II, there's a great recent book called Bloodlands by Annie Applebaum, which recounts a completely different narrative that says, I think the United States was involved in the European part, but it recounts, of course, the perspective from the Russian and Eastern European side, where there are untold millions of dead over a longer period of time, and it's a different story. It's not an all-win, all-victory narrative the way it is for the United States, which is why the stories are different and why the monuments are different. The Vietnam Veterans Memorial, I think one of the reasons it's so interesting, and I'm sure that you have thoughts on it, having played in the same area. First of all, its location is fundamentally more peripheral, definitely not part of the primary axis. Secondly, but it has some things in common. The use of grade change below as an alternative to, let's say, the other end of the spectrum, the Washington Monument. That this affords maybe, I like to say about the Vietnam Veterans Memorial that one of the reasons it is so successful is precisely because it works for both audiences about a conflict where there was profound disagreement in a way that there wasn't, at least domestically, for this. I just wonder if you have any thoughts about that.
No, I obviously, first of all, let me say I have, the absolutely utmost respect and admiration for Myelin's design, and but it, and I'll talk about this in a moment about, the need to instantly build a memorial versus to have time to reflect.
That was
I
very
think-
soon afterwards.
yeah,
That was like
yeah,
7 years
yeah,
later.
Fairly soon. I think Myelin's absolutely brilliant idea was that she insisted that she names every soldier who gave his life, and she insisted and won that she didn't list them in alphabetic order, which typically the Park Service would want it to be, but she listed them as they fell. Right. In other words, they are together the moment they were in a battle and they lost their lives, and she insisted that they are together on the wall, and this was phenomenal, right? But again, the interesting part of that is, of course, that had particular meaning for the veterans, right? When the veterans went and they saw their bodies that lost their lives, they saw them together. They didn't have to go do A at the end of this or do Z at the other end of the wall, but they were wherever they remembered the date, and they went to the date, and there they were. And this is phenomenal. But of course, it has a time limit to it, and that is once the veterans are all dead, and there's nobody else that you cannot keep that memory alive, right? That's how they felt. But for the moment, it was just an extraordinary, brilliant idea on her part to do that, and it helped the veterans immensely, to have an outlet for their grief.
That's an enormously powerful point, because it is a very specific choice.
Absolutely.
That serves a particular audience much better than it serves another down the road, and it would not be obvious. Let's say, unless you went with a father or grandfather.
In 100 years, it will not be remembered because the memory gets lost. All right. Now, the other issue that you touched on is, the distance of a memorial to the event itself, right? And you mentioned that the Lincoln Memorial was approximately 50 or some years later, and so was the World War II Memorial. And the question that I'm asked most often is, why didn't we build it earlier, right? And the answer, the answer clearly is, and you alluded to it very well. We would not have had the historic perspective. If we would have built the World War II Memorial, like say in the 50s or in the 60s, we wouldn't have had really the historic perspective of the meaning of World War II, right? Because now that we look back, now that we have the advantage of having an overview and a back view, right? We can see that the World War II Memorial was not only about the collapse of Nazi Germany and Japan. They're what they call the Axis powers, but it also had to do with the collapse of communism. Ultimately in Russia, right? And that came later, but it's still a consequence of World War II, right? And so you need to have the historic perspective for major memorials. So on the one hand side, the World War II Memorial has a lot of things in common with those kind of, I would say, classical memorials where you memorialize a significant event, event in the life of a nation. Right? There is, however, a difference in the World War II, and that has, in my mind, certainly to do with the fact that it was the biggest conflict that the world has ever known. It was fought on 5 continents. It was fought on all oceans. In total, 55 million people lost their lives. I mean, it was just something, and one cannot, I've talked about the triumph of democracy over tyranny, but one cannot overlook the suffering and the destruction that any war brings. War should not be really, war should be remembered. That's what I wrote in my competition brief. I had to make a statement, and I wrote, wars must be remembered, but they should not be glorified, right? And particularly, we Americans, that's different from Napoleon. No, nobody ever asked Napoleon how many French people he left behind when he went, roamed around Europe and captured every possible country at the time, right? When he came triumphantly back to Paris, nobody ever asked him how many Frenchmen he had left behind, right? Nobody asked. But we know almost to the number how many Americans lost their lives, soldiers, right? And that's extraordinary. Yeah.
That's a very interesting point, because I spent some time in Paris a few years ago, and it's very interesting to see how different countries deal with this issue of whether of memorializing, but also perhaps architecture and design serves as an interface between the state and the population in more ways than just memorials. It's very interesting. There's a very honorific building in Paris called the Hôtel des Invalides. And it is a weird combo platter of uses that you could never imagine existing in the United States. But it was a place where, during the time of Napoleon, the wounded soldiers would be taken. So oftentimes they were very wounded and were never going to really recover, but they had a place of tremendous honor in the city. In other words, they were this hotel, this place, this hospital, really. It had a big church in it, with one of the most amazing church plans anywhere, because it was unclear whether the king. Now, this might be. This, I guess, maybe is before Napoleon. Yes, it certainly was before Napoleon. There's a church. It has a nave with seats where the congregants, in this case the wounded soldiers, sit. And along the nave are the flags, the torn battle flags of the people they conquered. So here they are, wounded, some I imagine very wounded, sitting in the pews of a church with the battle flags of the people they'd conquered, and there above, raised up, is an altar, but the crossing, where the altar would usually be right under the crossing. In this case, that's not how it works. It's a little closer to the nave, because on the other side of the altar is where the king sits. And who's closer to God is unclear at this point in France, whether it's the priest or Louis.
Yeah.
And so at this Hôtel des Invalides, where the church and the state come together to celebrate warriors, wow, what an interesting story that is.
Yeah.
But it's different than a memorial. In a way, it's sort of a living shrine that does celebrate war, probably, but also celebrates or acknowledges the cost and venerates the participants. It's kind of like an old Roman kind of thing. But it's very interesting, because it makes you realize, and I will say, and I think Washington, D.C. is about as French a city as you're going to find anywhere in the world. Certainly it's more French than Paris, which was a medieval city and only got retrofitted to be a French city, of this type. Yeah. Washington, D.C. is as French a city as there is anywhere, which makes, by the way, comments that come out of Washington about France today, particularly hilarious.
Yeah.
No, French fries are not really the primary thing you should be
Yeah.
concerned about. Your entire city is French. So
Yeah.
just deal with it. But that framework, that clear hierarchy that provides siting with such meaning,
Yeah.
makes the design of monuments and memorials, I would argue, more meaningful and more part of a larger narrative than at any city that I can think of.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe outside of
Yeah.
Brasilia
Yeah.
by Oscar Niemeyer,
Yeah.
the late Oscar Niemeyer.
Well, that's interesting because as I'm listening to you, I also did read not the entire report, but significant part of the Macmillan report, right?
Yes.
And during the time when the commission was at work, they made a summer trip to Europe, the whole commission, and I think they had a great time, according to the report.
Well, Daniel Burnham always
yeah,
had a great time.
Yeah, well, they lived in grand style, let's put it this way. And they started in London, and from London they went to Paris, and then somehow they made their way down to Rome. Rome was their last kind of city on the itinerary. And then when they came back to Washington, I think it was McKim who wrote in the report, and there was a criticism of Washington. He said, you know, the monument of Washington should not be the general on the horse, because that's what they had everywhere and still have today, but it should be the water fountain, right? And that was precisely because they were in Rome and saw all the fountains in Rome, and they said the monument of Washington should be the fountain. And it makes so much sense because you know, Washington gets extremely hot in the summertime, and it's quite the heat can be quite aggressive, and it makes so much sense, right? And so I took this to heart. You know, when I saw that sentence, right, I said, hey, I'm going to have a lot of water and water fountains, and you know, the World War II Memorial is now the most popular public space in Washington.
Wow.
That's where people go to have lunch, you know, you know, when the workers in the government center, that's where they go have lunch and then sit on where the fountains are, and this brings me great joy. That must say that this brings me great joy, because that's what I had hoped for. That, you know, that celebration is not something that's in itself monumental or cast in stone, but it's lifestyle, that people enjoy their freedom and their luncheon and because that is the true legacy of World War II.
Let me open it up to questions from the audience here. Yeah, it's you. Oh, sorry. Can we do this? If you can just talk right into the mic.
We talk a lot about conflict, basically, with there being lots of military on the committee. So, what was that conflict? What was their opinion? How are their opinions different from the others?
Yeah, well, that's a very good question. I think it really is a mindset. You know, it is a mindset. They're quite outspoken, particularly if you achieve a certain rank and you're a commanding officer. It's in your blood, and sometimes it hurts because you know, they weren't really professionals in a sense that, you know, I was dealing with design, and my team we were dealing with design. And by the way, it wasn't just myself. We were a large team of landscape architects and other associated architects, and some of the comments were, you know, they were so off the wall, right? Then, you know, and I must confess, there were moments when, I mean, and I'm not talking about the public hearings, but, you know, meeting with my clients, that I looked at the door, and, you know, and I always thought that I have the option to walk out, right? Except when you work on such a high-powered project, you can walk back in. Yeah,
Right,
you
right,
can
right.
say, "Oh, made a mistake."
Right, right.
Yeah, yeah. So it was hard, you know. But again, I should tell you that Ambassador Williams was he was such a skilled diplomat that, you know, in a way, I don't know, I never spoke to him about it, but he must have foresawn that once I'm outside, well, after the competition is complete, and the competition, by the way, that this is also unheard of, had 2 juries. No, rarely to have.
I guess I remember that.
I have never heard of a competition that has 2 juries. They had one jury that was sort of judging the architecture, right, which was kind of the fine arts related, and the other one was a technical jury where they looked at the technical issues. Luckily, both juries were headed, the chairs of both were famous architects from New York, and that was quite helpful. And I think Ambassador Williams in the deliberate, and both juries, by the way, unanimously voted for my project. But Ambassador Williams must have understood that the jurors brought something, a discussion and knowledge to the table that once the jury is gone, his commission would not have. And so, in his wisdom, he actually asked the jurors to stay on as unofficial advisor to him, right? And you know, there were Hugh Hardy was one of the chairs of the juries. Ada Luisa Huxtable was on the jury. The Boston Globe's Robert Campbell was on the jury. There were a lot of nationally, internationally known architects and architectural critics on the jury. And Ambassador Williams asked them to stay on, right? But he had to do it secretly, you know. So we actually met at the American Academy Rome in New York. They're not in Washington, but because most of the architects were from New York, by the way. So it was also kind
logistical.
Logistically practical, let's say, and the president of the American Academy was delighted to be the host for that. And so we often met, right, secretly, you know, and so it was all to the benefit of Hayden Williams, so that when he met with his commission, you know, I heard him repeat things that Ada Luisa Huxtable said or someone else said. Right?
She just passed away
but,
a couple weeks ago.
You know, all of which, I expanded a little bit on your question, it just shows how complex and how, you know, how really sometimes difficult it is to maneuver, right? And also, I think every architect will tell you that, right? You also have to pick your fights. You know, you have to be very, very careful. You have to know what is what's worthwhile fighting for, and what simply you can't fight every point, because if you do that, then you get the reputation of being uncooperative, inflexible. I mean, you know, there are plenty of names that they can give you very, very quickly, right?
Right.
So you have to be, you know, when you take your stand, you really have to put everything you have into it, right? But choose it carefully.
We have another question here.
First of all, thank you for being here. You're being such an
That's my
inspiration to all
pleasure.
of us. You mentioned that in order to win competition, you have to break at least one rule.
Yeah.
Could you give us some other examples of rules you've broken that brought success?
Yeah.
Now this is being taped, and
Yeah.
so
All
we
right,
want to
yeah.
stay clear of any
Yeah.
felonies. Okay.
Yeah, okay. We want to stay, yeah. So I will not mention any architect alive, okay? Yeah. But does the name Alvo Alto mean something to you? Alvo Alto was a very famous, he was one of the early modern architects in the mostly in the first part of the 20th century. He built the Baker House in Cambridge for MIT, which is his
Curvy brick dormitory on the Charles River.
Along Charles River. It is that dormitory that is curved. Yeah, he was a Finnish architect. He did a lot of competition, and he won a lot of competitions, right? And he constantly violated the rules. He constantly did it. Yeah. So much so that at one point, which today would be absolutely illegal, it was a competition for an opera house in Germany, and there was a big park, and he had such an unorthodox proposal, and all the rules that they had, he violated. And they gave him the first, second, and third prize. Yeah. And if you do that, you have a lawsuit.
Yeah. Well,
No,
to be clear, though,
Yeah.
I think just what I think this you need to violate the rules really points to is that you need to reframe the question.
Yeah.
And implicit in the idea of violating the rules is that they have not asked the right question, and that you are bringing to the people who are putting the competition together a perspective that they didn't have. And that's why it's successful. You don't get rewarded for gratuitously violating the rules. You get rewarded for reinterpreting. Well, no. But I mean, I think it's worth saying you get rewarded for reinterpreting.
This is the right answer to your question. This is the right answer. You cannot just a priori say I have to violate a rule. They just kick you out.
Right.
You have to really restate the problem. Yeah. Because actually, in our profession, in architecture, stating the problem, if you face any design problem in front of you, is just as important as finding a design solution. You will always have to start. You know, the famous American architect Louis Kahn once said that the first act for an architect is to take, typically, when you get a program in a competition, we call it a brief, which is the outline of the objectives, what's expected, blah, 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 blah. He said the first task for the architect is to how did he say it?
Rewrite the brief?
To translate into the realm of architecture. Okay. In other words, it's often written by lay people, and you got to translate it into the realm of architecture, and so that you have something to work from, right?
To reframe the issue. Well, I want to thank you so much for coming and joining us.
Well, it was my pleasure.
Thank you. Okay, folks, very quickly, it's a beautiful segue between now and a week from today, because Monday is Martin Luther King Day, and I trust you all are doing something useful with your lives on that day. Be that as it may, that's not my responsibility. But our reference to Daniel Burnham, a member of the 1901 Macmillan Commission, is eminently relevant to our next guest, also an architect. Blake Middleton is the architect of the new tower that is going to rise above the Filene's, the shell of Filene's that sits downtown. How many of you know about this? Yeah. So he is the designer, Daniel Burnham, the member of the commission, of that Filene's. And our next guest is designing the new 600-foot tower that will rise above it. It'll be great. We'll see you then. Thanks a lot.
Well, thank you.